Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. My name is Reed. Along with me is Mike. Mike, how you doing, sir?
Hey everybody. I'm doing good, Reed. How about you?
I'm doing good. Always good to talk comics, and you and I are going to talk today about the
Yes.
the the state of comic books overall in the modern age. We have talked about some things that we thought you and I thought could fix modern comics. We've talked about DC comics. We just kind of want to look at the overall comic landscape. Where do we think we are? How did we get here? How are things covered? Kind of just all encompassingly look at everything and featuring with modern comics today. And so one of the things is one of the things we love about this channel for you and me, we wanted this to be just a place where we could have conversations. We love the comment section that we have, seeing stuff down there. That's always the most fun part for you and me in this is that's kind of what we wanted to have. And it's always interesting to see things because we can kind of see certain trends in our videos. Not that we get like hundreds of comments or anything, but you can kind of see over about 2 months where you and I can see some of the comments in the videos and kind of building trends. And one interesting one that you and I have seen on the videos is there is so much love and affinity for older stories, and modern stories don't seem to have that same kind of attachment. And so I think point one that we want to look at is, do we think the older stories are actually just fundamentally better stories with better art? Or is there a bit of nostalgia at play or anger towards the industry now? Like, I guess main thing I'd ask you, Mike, is do you think people really just genuinely connect with the older stories better? Or do you think there's a little bit of nostalgia tied into it as well?
I think it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
I really do. I think in the beginning of the medium's creation happened in, say like 1935, 1933. It was very derivative of what was happening in the newspaper comics. But, that all changed around 1938 when they started to create their own characters. In other words, the material in the earliest comic books was derived from guys and gals who drew comic strips and they were syndicated in the newspapers. So they were creating their own characters. They got printed into newspapers. And, somewhere in 1933, as the story goes, one guy got a job at a newsstand and decided, hey, the thing that sells the newspapers is the comics. Let's put them together and staple them and sell them just on their own. And the industry was born. So sometime a few years later, people thought, let's put in our own material, or they ran out of material that they could use that was previously syndicated. So the spark was lit to create your own characters. And out of that came several extremely talented people who had very imaginative storytelling ideas and a completely blank slate to go just, a free hand to develop whatever they wanted to. And of course, they developed all of the archetypes in our psyche and created these wonderful, marvelous characters with superhuman qualities, and it just created these wonderful stories and characters that have endured for 80 years now, almost 90 years, some of them. And so yeah, were the stories better then? They were fresh, they were new, they were reimagined archetypal characters. And yes, we had a lot of really talented people come to the forefront and really develop and flesh out this medium. And so yeah, no wonder they endure. Newer comics, you know, uh, since the 70s, people have been trying to build their own characters or tell stories on the backs of those giants of talent and creativity that gave us our first heroes. And it's been a difficult hike to climb that mountain once again. When it was fresh and untrod ground, and you had the group of amazing talents like Jack Kirby and Stan Lee and Gil Kane and all those great artists, Carmine Infantino, and storytellers like John Broome. And they were just, it was fertile ground. They were talented. They got there first, and that's just the way it is. Yeah, we have a heck of a lot of nostalgia for it. But yeah, it leaves the newer guys a little bit at a disadvantage.
It's interesting to me in that, like, I hear some folks say, I hear a lot of folks who defend modern comic books go, the older stuff has more nostalgia. And I understand that to an element. I do think there is a part of you that looks back on better days. I look as a kid, right? I root for all the same sports teams from when I was a kid. And you go back, and in my mind, nostalgia wise, because he won so much, it's like Michael Jordan never missed a shot. I'm sure if I actually watched a Bulls game from the 90s, he misses quite a few shots and make mistakes. But the nostalgia piece of me that remembers him winning all those championships looks at him and goes like, no, Michael Jordan like never lost a game mentally. Right. And so I do think there is an attachment to those older stories because there's some that you read when you're in your formative ages. Those are the times you become a hero. I think we all remember the time you pick up that first comic book of the character who becomes your favorite character, and it just hits you for some reason. Right. I think for me, I grew up reading Batman when I first heard Batman. Just, oh my gosh, he doesn't know any powers. This is the character I want to root for and read. That hits everybody differently. Everyone has that character that hits with them. So I do think nostalgia is somewhat of a factor. Where I will say I don't know that it's that big of a factor though, is I think nostalgia can also be a trap, and it doesn't always work. And then I will say there's creators who were doing this stuff 30 years ago who were still like not the original creators who were doing good. So like I look at
Neil
Batman,
Adams.
that's the perspective I always look everything through, right? Batman created in the 30s, late 30s. Okay, he has all these formative villains, Joker, Catwoman, all the original ones that are there. Neil Adams and Danny O'Neill come in the 70s and introduce Ra's al Ghul. Batman's been around 40 years at that point. Somehow, after 40 years of Batman stories, they were able to come in and create a new villain that worked. You go about 20 years later, I think you had what Chuck Dixon, Graham Nolan, Doug Mensch, they create Bane. Bane becomes and you're talking Batman's around probably almost 60 years at that point. And they become classic villains where Bane is up there with the Joker in terms of like when you think classic Batman villains, Bane is there, right? Spider-Man has had the same thing happen, right? Spider-Man's been around since the 60s. You had 30 years into Spider-Man being a character, they were able to come up with Venom, and they were able to come up with Carnage, who arguably have become humongous standout characters on their own, right? We've seen this with the X-Men and stuff like that, with characters like Deadpool and Cable, who came later. I think the thing is, what I will say about modern creators that bugs me a little bit, and there are still some absolute greats out there, I think they sometimes tread on nostalgia, but they don't do it with passion. And I think when you look at the older creators, what they had is they looked at the good things with nostalgia and they loved the characters and they were passionate about those characters. What I think modern creators are passionate about is the story they want to tell, not necessarily the character they are telling the story about. And I think I've seen that more and more with characters that have, I think, struggled in the modern landscape is instead of taking the characters as they are and going, okay, I've got Nightcrawler and I've got Wolverine and I've got Storm. Let me create a story that would challenge these characters as they are. They instead go, here's my story. How do I fit Nightcrawler, Storm, and Wolverine into that story? And if I got to change and morph them, I'll do it because that's the story I want to tell. And that's just not how the medium works. It's not that's not for if you want to take on these classic characters, you can't do that. It's kind of like if someone wanted to make a James Bond movie, a romantic comedy. You may want to make romantic comedies and you may love James Bond. You can't marry those two together and then get mad at James Bond fans when they're like, where's the action? And it's like,
Yeah.
well, you don't need action anymore. And that's kind of what seems to happen with some of these modern creators is I don't know that the story is bad actually. I think the story is actually pretty good. I think most modern stories are okay. The problem is they're not putting the story with characters that fit or creating a story around the characters they have. Instead, it's just like, no, I want to tell this story. And if I got to manipulate Spider-Man, Deadpool, and whoever into it, I'm going to do so. And I think that's the biggest difference in the approach is the old guys had nostalgia for the characters and they told a story that fit the characters. As I think now, I'm not saying they don't love the characters, but I think they love their story idea more than they love the character. And
The
if the
prime
story they want to tell tramples the character, then I think they kind of look at it, so be it.
the prime example of that is what Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil did with Batman and Green Lantern, Green Arrow. They totally, wrote the stories in a new way, but still incorporated their characters' characteristics, and they wrote with passion and gusto. I will say this about the original creators that can't go unsaid, and I'm not exactly sure how this matches up with the current creators, but coming out of the depression, these kids who created our favorite characters were young, 17, 18, 19, 22 years old, and they were making very little money, but they could make a living. They just happened to be creative, and they had to have a job,
Hmm.
and that's all that they could do. In a time when it was hard to find a good job, they were lucky enough to find themselves there, or unlucky enough, as fate would have it, later on in the 50s. But it was a real struggle to have a good job, and it was a real struggle and a real grind to keep the presses rolling with the material that they came up with. They were on a timetable. They had to work fast. They had to be good. And they had to do stuff that sold, or guess what? They were out of a job. Their backs and their necks and their families were literally on the line when they were creating this stuff. And I know that that puts a little bit of extra emphasis on the work that you do. Times were really tough, and they were there and they delivered. It wasn't easy for them, and a lot of them struggled mightily. And some people made it big and rich, and some people didn't, like Siegel and Schuster.
Yep.
And but most people, like Jack Kirby, managed to get along and get by. And for them, Lord only knows the motivation. Jack kept his family together and paid the bills. He struggled a lot, but hey, he created, almost everything that everybody loves about the Marvel universe, because
No.
Jack
Yeah.
Kirby was behind it, and he did some amazing, amazing stuff. And he didn't get rich off it, but he loved doing it. There's no doubt about how much he loved doing it, and that says a lot about it too. But also, you got to understand, they were his creations, and a
Yeah.
lot of these guys, they're probably working paycheck to paycheck too. I don't know what they get paid.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't seem like modern creators get paid all that well unless you're like, able to parlay it into some sort of producer deal or
and
something like that, like we've seen some
and
creators
they don't
do.
they don't even get to really create their own content. They're not developing, new superheroes really. For the most part, they're just working off of an old design, and it takes like real talent, like Neil Adams, to totally go in there and bring something new out of something old.
Yeah. I think the thing that's interesting too is I do think sometimes we as comic book fans get mad at the writers when it's not really the writer's fault. It's the editors, to be honest. Like, I think that's the biggest thing is there's so many of these stories that get published where you're like, what is the editor doing? Because that's the big part is like, at work, you and I both have been in positions where we have teams that we manage and
There's a
people that
point
we
there. There's a point there that I want to, before
and
we
if
skip
someone
over.
turns in subpar, if I put someone on a project and they come back to me with subpar work and it gets published, yeah, it might be on that person who wrote the subpar report, but it's also on me because I'm the one who commissioned them to do the report and I'm the one who okayed it to get published. And I think that's the thing is we oftentimes get so mad at the writers on these things. There should be another step of an editor seeing a comic book and going like, no, we're not doing that. No, that's not that we're not having that happen. That's a continuity error. That doesn't make sense with who this character. You would think there'd be pushing back, and I think that's the biggest thing now. Is it kind of just seems like the editors themselves sometimes just seem to be either not present, or maybe they're like too big of a fan of the people they're working with, and so they don't want to shoot down the ideas. And it's just so weird in that, like, I'll just say the big two. There's so many continuity errors that happen just even month to month in comic books, where it's like there should be, you would think, someone who would have a role with, like, we're not doing that. That doesn't work with the last issue, and instead it just doesn't seem to be there. And I think that's a huge piece that we have to look at in modern comic books. Is I think the other part is sometimes we get mad at these creatives. Like me and you have talked about this for a long time. Tom King, you and I both were furious at that Heroes in Crisis story with what they did with Wally West. And I think he's been a good sport about it and said things like, "Oh no, I wrote the story," and puts his name to it. But like I've heard a lot of people say that no, it was an editorial pitch that he had a story, and then they came back to him and said, "Here's the three characters you're using," and they told him who the two suspects in the murder. And like, I don't know how 100% true that is, but if it is, it's like, we sit here and have all this anger towards this creator of like, look what you did to Wally West. And it's like, he just had a story idea. He's trying to make it on a paycheck. He puts in his story and they, told him you're going to do this. And then he has to wear that, as the guy who was responsible for it. And again, that may be not the best example. I know there's sometimes these creatives do things that
No, it's
we get angry
perfect.
at. But
It's,
I
it's
think it's
perfect.
very simple. Like it'd be very much like with you and me. We've been in positions where if I would put an employee on a project, tell them, no, you're doing this, they do it, and then it goes badly. And then I look at the guy who did the report like, what are you doing? And that's, I think we have way too much of kind of passing the buck that seems to take place
I, I
between the two.
feel I feel the old school editors had a lot more hands in the pie than they do now. For all I know now, the editors, I don't know their job, but it seems like they do little more than, maybe, I don't know. I really don't know what the editors do. But I do think the old school editors like Julius Schwartz and Stanley, they had a lot more on the line, and they had a ship to sail. They had to make sure it went in the right place. But again, everything was brand new. You know, it was, the slate was completely clean. They could drive that ship, pretty much
Yeah, I mean,
anywhere.
it would be, I think, a more difficult job to kind of keep 60 years of continuity together as opposed to back then where it's probably 4 or 5. Um,
Yeah,
but again, it's one of those things. They seemed to be able to do it in the 90s, like 30, 40 years later. It's
yeah.
that's the weirdest part for me with modern comic books is, and granted, the 90s is not some glory days of comic books, but
But
they
they
at
did keep
least
it
seem
together.
to be keeping things together. Whereas it really seems
It's
mid
off the rails.
2010s
It's off the rails.
is when things went off the rails, where it was like,
Yeah,
man, this is really. And what's funny is they continue to take these outs too of reboots and resets, and they still can't keep it
yeah.
straight. And it's
Still
just,
goes off the rails.
yeah, it's something where I think we've seen this a lot in con. It's funny we talked about, what we see in the comments. I've seen so many people talk about how much they enjoy the Ultimate Universe right now, where it's very easy to read Ultimate Spider-Man and Ultimate Black Panther, and it keeps all in alignment. And I think that might be the future for comic books, is just kind of at a certain point in the next decade taking all of these characters and going, you know what, we're just rebooting. We're just Captain America, and it's, we're going to do it fresh, because I do think, whether it's Captain America or Thor or Flash or Green Lantern or whichever character, it's not that we don't like Hal Jordan anymore, that we don't like Barry Allen or Steve Rogers. It's just that so much has been done to these characters over so many years that, one, for fans, there's so many events that we don't like, and then two, I do get for the creatives, like, it's funny because I'm trying to give this new X-Men reboot a lot of grace, because I absolutely hated what they did with the Krakoa era. And like, I'll be honest, I think the stories are pretty good so far, because they have an impossible task. You have to rehabilitate characters that like took actions that were so beyond what those characters would do. It's like I don't even know where you start to put that character back together. And so like on some of them, they're just kind of ignoring the events and going forward. And like I think they're just trying to do the best they can with that. And I think that's one thing I would say with comic book fans right now, where sometimes we may be a little bit of the source of the problem too, in that there's so much anger and overreaction to things with comic books. And I want to make sure I'm clear on this. There is nothing wrong with getting mad, with critiquing things, with saying something's flawed, with pointing that out, with making there's nothing wrong with any of those things. Okay. I think it's good. I think there's a lot of places that do that. But we also have way too many folks that just pre hated it, didn't want to like it, read it, didn't like it still because they've talked about how much they're not going to like it.
Or they didn't even read it and they got mad.
And they
Like, I
still,
don't even
and that's
know.
the thing. I don't know how large a portion of fans that is. I do know there are a lot of, and I want to make very clear, I think it's absolutely essential for people to critique things they don't like, to express your opinion, to when something is not good, to state that you don't think it is good. I have no problem with anyone doing that. I just think we also have way too many people. It's kind of like when you go and watching a movie you don't want to like, you can't then claim that you're like fair and unbiased. It's like for me, I hate the Green Bay Packers. I'm a Bears fan. I can't stand the Packers. I am not an unbiased observer of any Green Bay Packers play. I
Yeah.
think every Packers quarterback ever was an overrated bum who should, and it's not that they were bad because they've had Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers who are both going to be in the Hall of Fame. It's that as a Bears fan, I can't watch anything with the
Right.
Packers without getting disgusted by that ugly green and yellow uniform and everything it stands for. And so
Right.
I know when I watch the Packers, I'm not a good observer of the
Right.
Packers fairly. I couldn't assess it because I don't like them that much.
The refs
I
are
think
always
what
against you on a Packers
yeah,
game.
they're always and they always pound my Bears to dirt every year. And the
Yeah.
whole thing is, I think that's some of what we have now with modern comic critiques, where you have people where there's so much bias against what's going on that even when stuff's not that bad, we make it worse. Because I think what's happened is there are legitimately some awful comic books being made. Like there are really bad comics being made right now.
Unfortunately.
But
Yep.
there's some that are pretty good, and then there's some that are great. But what happens is when you claim that everything's awful, what ends up happening, it's the boy who cried wolf. You
Yeah.
don't actually when those genuinely awful comic books happen, the ones that should be just called out and killed with fire kind of thing, you lose the impact of complaining about it because you complained about every single other thing that's come out. And I
And
think
there's
that's
some good
so much of
stuff
what's
that's come
happened.
out recently. There's some good stuff.
Yeah.
You can't deny it. There's some great talent out there that's putting out some good books. I'm
Yep.
excited to go to the comic shop tomorrow. I'm a Thursday warrior. I'm
The
excited.
work schedule has forced you to evolve that by a day.
Yeah, I'm a
Yeah.
Thursday. Yeah.
No, no, I just think that's the thing is I do wish there was just slightly more, and I'm biased because it's what we do here, but I just wish there was slightly more positivity about the things that were good and that granted, I'm not besmirching anybody for doing what they do. People make their videos and do their stuff, and that's if they found success being negative, good for them. I'm not here to critique anybody for anything, but it is just always sad to me with comic books and that everything is so divisive now. And
You
I
know
think
why?
it's just lost its meaning because everything's divisive and those few things that are like absolutely should be don't have as much impact because it's complained about so often with everything.
I get you, Reed. I get you. And I just want to say, I Reed and I are always looking for good new comics. We can go to our comic shop retailers and ask them what's coming out and take a look and see what's coming up. But I really would love to hear from our viewers to see like what are some of the gems that you've discovered. We
Mm.
like to keep it positive here because the thing is, the reason we're so passionate about it is because we love this medium, you know. And even the haters, the reason they're so angry is because they really love it. They want it to be a certain way or whatever. But in life, there's always the bad, the all right, the good and the great. And you know, I will say this: for all the bad out there, it just makes the ones that are good that much more special.
Yeah, no, I agree with you wholeheartedly on that, and that like it's really well, me and you both love the medium, and the medium's so cool, and that it's one of the rare things that from your childhood can carry over to an adulthood kind of thing, and it's great for me as a father. It's so much fun to get my kids to read older comic books and see them read the stories and have fun and stuff like that. Even though my oldest son is into manga, there's still something about, hey, he's reading something that's similar to comic
It's
books.
kind of like comics.
Yeah, it's close, right? It's kind of,
Yeah.
it's there. And so I think the thing is, yeah, like that, a lot of it does come from passion. It does come from people caring and loving the medium and things like that. And yeah, I agree. I think even the negative, it's kind of like sports. It's interesting in that like sport. I compare comic books and sports so much because it's one of the only things from my childhood that has carried over both. Like my entire life, I've been a fan of the same teams and same comic book characters, and it's interesting because like fandom has the same thing. I think in sports, what's interesting is like you have those fans who are just super negative all the time. Like they're just always, your team is always the worst, your quarterback is always the worst, your team is always the worst, and then that player retires and you're like, oh, they were really good. And it's like, man, their entire career, you were talking about how bad they were every week. And
Uh,
I think sometimes you just get folks where that passion manifests itself that way. Um, I think it's interesting to just see the overall state of comic books, and I hope we can see some great stories. What we love seeing in the comments, guys, if you guys see great stories out there that you're reading, feel free to call them out on there. We'll love to check them out and kind of mention them on the channel and bring it up and stuff like that. We're always looking for good comic books. It's always fun to check things out, and I have to say, I was not an indies guy at all. Like, I don't think I'd ever bought an indie book until a decade ago when James Bond finally became like an indie book at Dynamite. It literally took like my second favorite character ever getting a comic book for me to become a guy who bought indies. And it did work. And like I have to say, there's so many good indie titles that come out, every month now, and it's just fun to read those and engage. But let us know, what do you guys think below? Do you think the comic book industry is in a bad place because of the stories that are told now? Do you think nostalgia from the past kind of blinds us to things now? Just overall, what do you guys think about how comic books are going right now? And if you're positive about comics, what is it that's making you positive about comic books? What is it that you love about the medium and what it's doing now? As always, folks, thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you in our next video. God bless you.
Thanks, everybody.